is a professor at Johns Hopkins University, where he researches international relations, racial politics, and post-colonial theory. Really broad palette. And he's the author of a bunch of books, actually, including one I just finished called The Black Pacific, Anti-Colonial Struggles and Oceanic Connections. And he's author of a brilliant journal article that we're going to talk about today called Republicanism and Imperialism at the Frontier, Post-Black Lives Matter Archaeology of International Relations. My guest is the legendary Robbie Shilliam. Thanks for coming on the show, brother. How are you?
Oh, I'm good, and it's good to touch base again with New Zealand, man. Very good.
Yeah. So people who don't know, Robbie once taught where I teach at Victoria University of Wellington. Unfortunately, we did not overlap.
Yeah, oh, that's a shame. And I'm sorry you're ill.
Yeah, me too. Trust me, me too. It's all good. So, okay, scene setter maybe. Like in 2020, we have the police, murdering George Floyd on camera. The BLM protest movement, it just explodes. And then like all of the gatekeepers of international relations suddenly want to engage the topic of race again, right? But for like 50 years, there's been a big racial blind spot in IR theory. You point out in your article that some of the even like big classical IR scholars back in the day, they engage directly with questions of race and IR sometimes. But that earlier history of their engagement with things like the global color line, it was just kind of missing from the IR field's response to BLM in 2020. Can you talk about that? Was that what was motivating you to write this? Like, what kind of intervention were you making?
Yeah, it's a good question, and in a way, part of it I'd need to talk about being in the US Academy.
Yeah.
Van, the kind of people who watch the podcast, they kind of academic-y.
Yeah.
Because I'm just trying to figure out what it is that might be interesting to people.
Grad student scholars.
Okay. All right, man. Okay. All right. So I did my undergrad. I did all my study in the UK, and I was in the UK until 2007, and I went to where you are for about 5 years. Then I came back again, and then I was in London for about 7 odd years, and then I came to the US in 2018, right? And I'm saying that because doing international relations in the UK and in much of the rest of the Anglo world, maybe partially except for Canada, you don't necessarily do it as a subfield of political science, right? And in the US, you've got political science, you've got 4 main subfields: American, comparative, IR, and theory.
Yeah.
The UK especially, whilst certain departments, and there are some kind of trends to try and make it more like the US always treated political science as a kind of applied enlightenment, as they called it, applied enlightenment science. Whereas in the UK, it was very much, if you wanted to know about politics, you did the classics, right? And the classics taught you, how to do dead languages, like basically it was like hazing, right? And ethics and law and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so international relations in the UK was quite non-disciplinary. I did it in a department at Sussex, which was literally a department of international relations. So when I did my PhD, I kind of did historical sociology, bit of anthropology, development studies, a bit of social theory and all that, right?
Yeah.
So my trajectory academically, when I've been doing stuff to do with race and racism and colonialism, imperialism, post-colonialism and all that, I always did it interdisciplinary. And I occupied the kind of IR space as a kind of applied studies space, right? Rather than a disciplinary space. So I could write that Black Pacific book, which no, IR scholar in the US is ever going to read, which is fine because it's nothing to do with political science. It's kind of hodgepodge, right? So now I get to the US, and in the US, this is the third continent I've taught on, and it's the most disciplinary in terms of the actual formation of the academy.
Kind of narrow.
Probably the most hierarchical as well, more hierarchical than the Germans in some way. And what I've been challenged to confront is the fact that my interdisciplinarity, whilst intellectually could be seen as a virtue, has no traction in the field here, right? Because I'm not, for scholars or for grads, I'm not dealing with the political science literature or the field even. So now Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, all that response. And where I am at Johns Hopkins, we decided to do a response which was kind of more than just simply saying that we support Black Lives Matter and all that. We actually put together a white paper, and the department unanimously approved it, which was a racial politics research theme, which connected undergraduate, graduate research, and even hiring to the extent that you can. The ambition has been to make an intervention into political science, to put racial politics at the center of the study of political science, not American politics, but political science per se. All of that means that when in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter, what I was challenged to confront was the fact that the way that I had done work before wouldn't help the situation, because people could just say, "Oh yeah, so if you want the race stuff, well, you just go to Black Studies. If you want that you go somewhere else, right?" And then political science is political science, and of course there's a race, ethnicity, and politics kind of field in political science, but even that is kind of ghettoized a bit. So I thought, well, then let me take the field at its word. Let me not poke around the edges of the field. Let me not try and be a way out. Let me not talk about, like we were talking in my book, Rastafari, hinterlands, spiritual hinterlands, and all that kind of stuff. And let me take the peeps at the center. And in my PhD, I'd actually done a chapter on Hans Morgenthau, and I come across this book, The Purpose of American Politics. And that book, The Purpose of American Politics, he writes in the aftermath of the Brown versus Board of Education decision in the 50s, in which the State Department had an amicus brief saying, let's make sure that we desegregate education, because if we don't, it's going to be a gift to the communists, right? So Morgenthau takes this seriously, that the freedom struggle in the US, the Black freedom struggle, is intrinsically an issue of prime importance for the study of foreign policy and the American purpose of politics. And he writes that book, in basically saying this global revolution that's happening, the liberation struggles, the freedom struggles, the anti-racist stuff, all that, this is an issue. This is a phenomenon which is going to fundamentally impact the ethical calculus of the Cold War. IR scholars must deal with it. IR scholars can't leave it to the law people, can't leave it to anybody else. IR scholars have to deal with it. And so I thought, here's Morgenthau, who everybody reads in IR as a subfield of political science, and Morgenthau gives you the 6 principles, whatever it is, of realism, blah, blah, blah. Everybody teaches Morgenthau as a classical realist. No one teaches Morgenthau as a theorist of race, right? And in that book, his first it's his second comprehensive book on American politics. He makes race really pivotal to the whole argument. And I'm like, 2020 now, all these peeps going in IR saying, what we're going to do about racism? Shall we import it from elsewhere? Shall we farm it out to elsewhere academically? Is it just a normative problem? We can talk a bit more about why the problem about taking it as normative or as just a moral problem. So my thing is, there's got to be some fundamental disjuncture in why, even when you're in the center of the field, no one knows that Morgenthau was a theorist of racism and referenced the Black freedom struggle as fundamental to our understanding of foreign policy. And here we are in 2020, where Foreign Policy Magazine, Council on Foreign Relations are all talking about the impact of BLM on American standing in the world. So that disjuncture is what I wanted to deal with. And I wanted to deal with it at the center of the field rather than at the margins. Yeah.
Dude, that is fascinating. That was like the most entertaining, educating answer I've ever gotten to anything. That's great.
Oh, gosh, man. Well, you're easy to please.
Good start. Yeah, that's fascinating. Do you see IR theories? I have a question about Hans Morgenthau later, but do you see IR theories rush to like re-engage with racism after BLM 2020? Do you see that sharing something with like how corporations started advertising their support for BLM and racial diversity in 2020, or is it like a different kettle of fish?
Yeah. I think there's some of that at the institutional level. And you can see that insofar as, everybody is giving out lip service to George Floyd.
Yeah.
But not actually changing how they do anything. Right.
Nancy Pelosi and kente cloth. That's my classic.
Yeah, but also our own institutions, which last year I was a VP for the ISA, so I love the ISA. I'm always there. I love it.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
But ISA did a terrible job. I mean, it was a lip service kind of response. APSA did an even worse response, especially to the 6th of January stuff, right? British International Studies Association, probably only one which did something half decent, right? So yes, that's correct. But I think something else is going on. And I think something is going on, especially amongst graduate students and early career people, which is that they have a palpable sense, and they combine this with the debt crisis, with the climate crisis, all these kind of things. They have a palpable sense that the fundamental frictions, contradictions, struggles in the world right now, the epochal intergenerational ones, they're ill-served to account for that through the literature that they've been given as grads and through the methods and methodologies that they've been given. And that they are yearning to do meaningful work, and they find that they're short-circuited. Right. So I think that there's now that works out very differently. It's not a revolution, don't get me wrong, but I think it is an intergenerational shift. And I think BLM was a fundamental part of that. Right. So I think I'm a little bit more, I'm suspicious about institutional statements. They go along the lines that you're talking about, but I don't think I'm suspicious about a new generation of scholars who, even if they don't end up doing, research on racism or colonialism or imperialism or whatever, they think that it's a no-brainer to them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That they need to have some kind of understanding of it.
Man, you are describing me to a T. I mean, complete dissatisfaction with like the methods and practices of like what I was trained to do and how we do deal with this like widget making intellectually in, like we're all factory workers in the intellectual academy or whatever. And like recognizing that any way of like thinking about the world that sort of erases history and power relations in history is like inadequate, and race is like pretty crucial to that. Yeah. It's a little bit like the lies my teacher told me kind of thing. It's like we're searching, interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's even things like, for example, like I actually don't, let me put it this way. So I'm actually not an anti-quants person. I'm not an anti anything like that. Sure. Actually.
Same.
For me, the question is, what's the rationale for using the methods that you're using? And do you know why those methods became useful for studying something like racism? So there's a reason why, for example,
Colonial
amongst black
science, yeah.
political, yeah, but there's a reason amongst, for example, black political scientists in the US why they turn towards, behavioralist models of electoral behavior, because suddenly at some point black people started getting into halls of power municipally and nationally. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that coming out of that whole era from the Black Panthers and Black Power, I mean, this is a really important, empirical development in the black struggle, right? And one would want to figure out what's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I mean? So the method is never apolitical. It's never doing the work for the method's sake, but it's doing the methods for the problem's sake. Do you see what I mean? And so I think that a lot of the problem that our younger scholars have with the training, which they might sometimes mistakenly conflate with a particular method, is the fact that they are taught the methods absent of the politics which surrounds it, which is absent of the actual fact that you it's a problem. It's a problem that you got to try and figure out, rather than it's a method you got to home. Did you get what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's the kind of thing, because I remember when it was the War on Terror, early 2000s, and all the theorists were saying, okay, I'm paraphrasing, forgive me, I'm doing it theatrically to make a point, right? But I remember a lot of the political theorists in IR, for example, were going, the war on terror proves Carl Schmitt right, and I'm like, that's not what the war on terror should be proving. I mean, he was a kind of a Nazi lawyer, right? But I mean, and I'm not saying you can't get something interesting out of him. What I'm saying is they reversed the thing. It's, if you wanted to get some utility out of Carl Schmitt, it would be because it would explain something to you about the war on terror.
Yeah.
But a lot of the dudes were saying there's a whole cottage industry around Carl Schmitt saying the war on terror proves Carl Schmitt right. Now that's exactly the same as the depoliticization of quant methods and behavioralism. It's exactly the same.
Yeah. It's only true if you want it to be true. You're insisting.
It's like, you're doing this in service of what?
Yeah.
And I don't even mean that politically. I just mean that intellectually. You're doing it in service of what? The political thing can come, and I have my politics, but I'm just saying, even before that, you're doing it in service of what intellectual problem?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a big purpose-oriented question that I think like everybody, the younger scholars, of course, have to find jobs. They have to feed themselves. So they have to comply with the system as it is. But they're also, we're a purpose-driven generation, and so in service of what is the haunting question at all times for me. And I know I'm not alone in that. So in your in this article, you talk about 4 different prominent thinkers, right? William Allen, Frederick Jackson Turner, Mersey Tate, who never really got her flowers in IR, to be honest, and of course Hans Morgenthau. And I want to kind of like pose a question to you about each of them, but I also wanted to talk first about the concept of the frontier. So like one of the things that was like triggering for me about this article in a good way is that I've been trying to like work on something that maps out how American foreign policy elites, many of whom are like my former friends, are rediscovering the Pacific region, but they're frontierizing it in the way that they imagine it as a strategic space. And like, it's really worrying or bothering me because like, I don't know, like, how do you think of a place as a frontier when it's A, been here the whole fucking time, B, you're firmly entrenched there. Your power, like your power is based there. So like, I don't have a solution for how to think about this, but it just strikes me as a profoundly important concept, the frontier. Can you talk about that, how it's racialized, relates to democracy and empire and all that?
Let me get you a book. Hold on. I'm getting you a book. If I can find it, come here. Right. This Epile author.
Nice.
We Are the Ocean.
All right.
Right. And he's a famous academic associated with Fiji, right?
Yeah.
And there's a chapter in here called Our Sea of Islands, right? Our Sea of Islands, and I was put onto this by one of our colleagues actually at Victoria University. He passed away a few years ago. Teresia Tiaiwa, who was in the Pacific Studies. She did her PhD with Angela Davis in history of consciousness.
Yeah.
She's, very big Pacific cultural theorist, and also in our IR community, a feminist theorist of militarism and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But so that's where I got that from. But there's a very simple kind of geographical image there, a sea of islands, right? Now you counterpose the sea of islands, and this is what Teresia Tiaiwa did. You counterpose that with the Pacific Rim, the idea of Pacific Rim, right? The Pacific Rim, which is the kind of strategic version, is basically the ocean is empty, and then you have the rim, and then what transverses the ocean is the military. You get what I mean? So, like, I went on holiday once to Cook Islands for my 40th a while ago, and there's a little tiny island there called, which New Zealand Prime Minister David Lange always used to go to. What's it called? I can't remember the name of the small island. Oh, Atutaki. And it's tiny, tiny, tiny. But you land there, and they've replaced the airport, the runway now. But the old runway was made during the Second World War by the US military, so that they could store fuel there for for planes in the Pacific theater to reload and all that kind of stuff, right? And how they made the runway was they dredged up part of the coral reef, crushed it, and made that the runway. Now, if you want an image of the military, the Pacific, the frontier, and all that in the Pacific, that's the image. Do you get what I mean?
Destroy the religious land so that you can build a refueling station as you pass through.
Right. And then very soon after you start, doing testing, in the Marshall Islands, right? So now, and the French too. The Sea of Islands populates the Pacific as a navigable, heterodox space of people, connections, language, politics. The frontier, as the famous Frederick Jackson Turner thesis is, it's empty land. It's empty land, which renews it's a very masculinist idea, which renews the energies of civilized people by putting them face to face with primitiveness, i.e. survival. And that renews them, gives them an individualism, a rigor, right? But also a democratization, that everybody is equal on the frontier because you all got to solve the same problem, right? And the trope there's a very deep-seated trope in US kind of culture, which is this ever-renewing frontier.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the frontier is only the frontier insofar as you can claim that it's empty land. And people in this, that you're talking about in this article, that William Allen, who's a kind of progenitor of political science, actually, but very underrated. And then Frederick Jackson Turner, who's the student of William Allen. Their whole idea about the democratic nature of the frontier is that it's the one place in the world, the US frontier, in which imperial sentiment, imperial energy can be transformed into republican arrangements, right? Only holds insofar as you treat indigenous peoples as part of nature.
Wow.
And only so far, and this is another part of the history, as you only insofar as you say that the movement west, which in the US was driven from one point of time quite significantly by the movement west of slavery, the Civil War is the result of that, right? Only insofar as you can say that the movement west actually gets rid of slavery, right? Now, when the thing with Mers Tate's work in diplomatic history in the Pacific is that she demonstrates that one of the big problems in Hawaii with the American ministers in the 1850s and stuff, 1850s, 60s,
60s, 50s,
is that is that the Hawaiian, the Kanaka Maoli, the Hawaii people are saying like, but we fall south of that compromise latitude, the Missouri Compromise, which means that if we're incorporated into the US, you're gonna enslave us. Right?
Oh yeah.
So
Shit.
right. So there are two elements of this frontier thing, right? One is it's got to be empty land, and secondly, it's going to turn into Republican arrangements.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to move away from the slaving. It's going to create a new frontier of freedom and all that, and association and all that. And both of those things are not right. I mean, the frontier moved westward because driven in good part, not only but in good part, by the necessary ecological movement westward of plantations, and that led to a civil war. And then when you get to the Pacific, but what people like Gerald Horne have done this work showing that from the 1860s, after when plantation model gets into trouble in the mainland, then it gets exported to the Pacific, to Hawaii, Fiji, Hawaii even more, Fiji, and then Queensland in Australia. So that's what's at stake in the frontier. A lot of the ideology of the US as an exceptional power in the world is to do with the frontier motif. That it's the one place in the world where imperial force can be turned into Republican arrangements, right? In the Pacific too, but it's also the ideology which displaces the violence and the militarism of that movement westwards. Hence, we talk about the Pacific Rim, and we denude it of actual substance, human substance, which is the Sea of Islands.
Wow. I never thought about the concept of the Pacific Rim as actually naturalizing a frontier way of thinking, but that's totally true.
And in those films, man, like the only thing that comes out which is birthed in the Pacific are those monsters, right?
It's all threats and resources, yeah. Wow. Yeah. So the frontier concept is, so it's like almost a naturalized part of American exceptionalism, which justifies using empire to realize democracy. Like all these things are kind of linked in a perverse way.
Right. And even going back to Machiavelli, one of the fundamental, not the only, but one of the fundamental kind of problems in political theory is the relationship between empire and republicanism, right?
Yeah.
What force do you need to make the republic, and then does that force undermine the republic, right?
Yeah.
And so that is a very deep trope in political theory. You can go back to the the Romans and all that kind of stuff, right? But then American exceptionalism is predicated on the idea that only this frontier movement can create republican arrangements out of imperial force.
Yeah.
And so people like Morgenthau now, they kind of accept that, but then they're, Morgenthau likes the tragedy, right? All these German realists were all, tragedians, right?
Yeah.
And so, their whole thing is hubris is going to overtake you. So actually doing the minimal violence is better than trying to make the whole world peaceful, because in making the whole world peaceful, you'll probably exert the maximum violence, right?
Yeah.
So there's that kind of original ethics in classical realism. And so Morgenthau takes Turner and says, you're being idealistic, I'm going to be tragic. And so my tragedy is to say that the freedom struggle is always part of the frontier movement westwards, and it never gets over that. And that's why he thought that the Soviet Union was an empire like any other empire, and it was conventional. It wasn't an existential crisis problem for the US. Where he thought the first existential crisis was in foreign policy was in the Korean War, because there you had peoples who were professing the same ethics as the US, i.e. national self-determination, and you were actually having a fight with that. Whereas for him, the Soviet Union was just another imperial exercise, and so there's no ethical quandary there. So Morgenthau is treating the frontier as a tragedy. It's like the thing that you'll never get beyond. You will always undercut your ethics. You will always undercut your purpose, to create an enlarged freedom and self-determination. But you must have that ethical compass, else you will undercut even more freedom and self-determination, which was what his kind of diss of the Eisenhower regime was. That Eisenhower regime saw the Cold War struggle in quantitative terms, saw it as simply, a battle of force between a quantitative battle of force between the Soviet Union and the US, like economics, military power, all that. And Morgenthau was saying everybody else in the world, including black people in the US, see it as a qualitative struggle. What is the most meaningful form of freedom and self-determination between these two? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so his kind of thing was to say we must treat this as an ethical register rather than simply a strategic register, because we'll never be able to actually have the purpose how we want it, right? So we have to pursue the purpose in ways which mitigate the least amount of violence. And so he made Turner's frontier a kind of tragedy, such that is always at the forefront of your strategic calculus. And that's why he says, following Turner, when the frontier is closed down by the census in 1894, whenever it is, i.e. when you could say in terms of population there is no more frontier.
Yeah.
He follows Turner to say new frontiers are now found in science. You go back to Kansas and you figure out how you can do agronomy better in Kansas. He also says you go back to the social sciences, right? And you figure out how you can manage populations in towns even with better freedom. And then you go to the universities and you do it there. And so Morgenthau says that's the purpose of the political scientist, right? To keep the ethics of self-determination at the forefront of a strategic calculus. That's how you best pursue the American purpose, which is found on the frontier, but always tragically.
Man, that is just like not how Hans Morgenthau is popularly remembered as father of classical realism, This is wild.
And that's why race is fundamental to that argument, because he says, the Black freedom struggle, i.e. what we would nowadays call abolition, like even after formal emancipation, abolition is still there. It's still a prospect, a future prospect. Said this is the best demonstration of the tragedy of the American purpose, and that all the rest of the world know it.
Man, yeah, as an IR scholar trained in America, obviously I've read my share of Hans Morgenthau. I never read the Purpose of American Politics book. Never came up. Fancy that.
And you know who said it was his best piece of work?
Who?
A guy called John Hertz, who's the originator of the phrase "the security dilemma."
Yeah,
Hertz said it was his best work.
That's how does stuff like this drop out of the canon? Like, how does the canon emerge? That's what I want to know.
Well, you know what I think about that? I think it's incredibly presentist. I think what we call the canon is a very, very recent invention. I did this after the Freddie Gray, that's Baltimore 2015, after the George Floyd stuff in 2020. I kind of convened a lot of the scholars who, from the kind of late 80s onwards, kind of started to try and inject the study of racism back into race and racism back into IR, right? And they were all a generation who were kind of trained in the late 80s, mainly early 90s. And what's really interesting is that apart from a few, very few of them knew that up until the early 70s, IR scholars were talking about race and racism, right? And so that for me tells me something, that the actual cutting out of race as a phenomena of fundamental importance for international relations actually happens over a 10-year period, maybe. I mean, it's very, very acute, and it's
Jesus,
the
yeah.
same period where John Rawls comes in and transforms political theory so that now you have a veil of ignorance and you do everything analytically in the abstract, rather than when at the same time you've got the new international economic order, you've got Vietnam, you've got all these very embodied arguments and debates about what global justice means, right? So there's a very funny thing that goes on. But to your point, man, I actually think that really we canons can be rewritten incredibly quickly within 1 or 2 intellectual generations.
Well,
and generations, I mean PhDs.
Yeah.
Like say 5 years.
Yeah.
2 5-year periods, and you can rewrite a canon.
Yeah. I kind of wonder if we're going through that now. I mean, I'm not sure. And like part of it depends on how you interpret the IR's re-embrace of race since 2020. But yeah.
Interesting, man.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean that is interesting. And I think I mean, I think that I have my doubts that the entrenched interests, I don't mean this conspiratorially, would change what they're doing. I mean that not conspiratorially, but for very boring, kind of institutional analysis reasons, right? But I think that there is a much more of a groundswell around those kind of centers of the field.
There's an interest or a demand to like recanonize or decanonize or something, but like there's also like these intense lock-in mechanisms, like career incentives, all the journals in the field being controlled by all the disciplinary, like it's about depoliticizing and focusing on methods so hard, generally quant, that like you sort of erase the political context or purpose of what you're doing, and you narrow your gaze, and like that makes it hard
and it's very difficult to get out of that, right? Now, and I think to get to one of them points, right, that after what we know of the history now of political science from Jessica Blatt, Bob Vitalis, Michael Hanchard, a number of other people, right, is that the race was a phenomena of fundamental importance for political science from its generation. I would say William Allen is one of the progenitors, actually, up until the Second World War, and whether it's in terms of eugenics or Teutonism or what, it's not controversial. Just like the idea of empire is not controversial. Nowadays we're talking about hierarchy versus anarchy. I mean, but empire was like the fundamental form of international relations, right? So now, then you've got the Shoah during World War II, and then there's a very condensed and intense period after World War II, say 10 years, 5 to 10 years after World War II, where political science has to reinvent itself. It can't do the eugenic stuff, at least not for 5 or 10 years, right? It can't do that anymore. But it also has a normative prescription, which is that it's the science which helps society regulate itself in democratic fashion. After the Nazis, now with the totalitarians like the communists, right? Political science is supposed to serve a well-regulated democracy, right? Yet it has to do so through science, scientific means. But those scientific means, which were once in good part anchored through eugenics, now can no longer be anchored through eugenics. And so so there's a whole set of arguments and about how race becomes filtered back in through ideas about culture, population, ethnicity, and all that. But just put that to one side, and what happens in this concentrated period is that if you are being a scientist, if you talk about race, you're either a Nazi, right? Or you're doing a moral discourse, because race has no place in science. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, but then what that means is the fact that just because the Nazis got defeated doesn't mean that racism got defeated, especially in the US, right?
100%.
Well, and not only the US, but like
We
so
hired
what that
Nazis
then,
to fight the Cold
well,
War.
you
I mean,
know,
what the
like,
fuck?
so what that then means is that that period in the US from the 50s and the 60s, which is the Black freedom struggle period par excellence, where you've got people like William Patterson and the Civil Rights Congress going to the UN and charging the US with genocide according to the new Genocide Convention, i.e. lynching and Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm.
None of that can be factored into political science main, because political science are now comprised of scientists who don't do the moralizing,
Yeah.
and of course aren't Nazis. You know, like, because who would want to be a Nazi?
Yeah.
Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean that really. So then for a long period, the study of race and racism then becomes a study amongst black people, black scholars, Jewish refugees and emigres, right?
Yeah.
Indigenous people. Do you see what I mean? That's where it is, but then that is always denuded from the mainstream, because again, you can't do race in political science unless you're a Nazi and you want to do eugenics, or you're a moralist. And if you're a moralist, then this has no place in the science.
They try to compartmentalize it or keep it in a box. Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, it's not, I don't mean this in a kind of conspiratorial way.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, this is this compact which comes afterwards, right? So now when Black Lives Matter comes along in IR, I don't know. I've never met an IR person, even a security studies person, who would profess to be a racist. You know what I mean? I've never met someone who wouldn't agree in principle that all lives are equally valuable, you know, wherever they come from, whatever they do.
Yeah.
Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
And so the big outpouring after 2020 in the field was effectively a moral outpouring. It was like, this is terrible. But it was way harder to integrate that into an analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Because the analytical tools that we had, right, didn't reference race, because that had to be taken out.
Yeah.
So much of the work that we've been doing since has been to, you know, and to be fair, some of the so-called gatekeeper journals have tried to be open to it. You know,
they're trying. They're genuinely trying.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. But this is where we are now. Do you get what I mean? I teach a course at the moment with my colleague here, Sebastian Schmidt, on race and international relations. And I start off the course, and every week I say, this isn't about morals. This is about analysis.
Mm-hmm.
How do we have a more acute analysis of power in the world if we actually factor race into the center of it?
Yeah.
It's not about who's the good guy, the bad guy, who's the racist, who's not the racist. I don't give a damn about
it.
Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
That you can do that easily. That's not what we're trying to do here. And that's, I think, where that's where the method, what you said, the focus on method for method's sake, that's where it becomes a problem, because that focus on method for method's sake didn't come from nowhere.
Yeah.
Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it comes from this post World War II Cold War era of trying to get rid of the eugenics and the race, but also trying to be still the saviors of democracy, right? And so then you need a science which is denuded of the actual politics of the thing, right? And so then you focus on methods, and then methods become baked into graduate studies, get baked into tenure and promotion and appointments and big journals and all that kind of stuff. And then it simply becomes a route, in the Weberian term, a routinized thing.
Yeah.
And the people who do it, I don't think have any cognition of the actual deeper politics behind it. I don't think they're bad people.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But it's like an entire architecture that's been built on kind of like false foundations. It's like, on one level, it's like not reckoning with its IR's own imperial origins, but also like in the present, even in the Cold War, we were preserving various forms of imperial relations, and we were doing a lot of these things. We were perpetuating like extreme militarized violence against at an immense large scale, but we were just sort of narrating it in a way where it's like, well, we're defending democracy, you know? And so like if that is the foundation for the sort of scientific toolkit that we use to sort of build knowledge widgets in our journals and our books, then like it's very and that's where we're stuck with now. We're trapped a little bit. And so you have a journal like Security Studies that's very good, and they published something by Sebastian Schmidt about like very good piece. They published something by me about like left imaginaries of foreign policy. But like it was like a miracle that they were embraced these pieces. And the problem is that these pieces are anomalies relative to like the ocean of other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can think of a few things about that, Van, and I think one is that the jury is out. I tend to be skeptical, but the jury is out about whether what we've come through it's a horrible term, but a George Floyd dividend, and the dividend of which is running out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that, for example, the work that's been going on in APSR, I think that has been actually very structurally good work. I hope that it survives. I don't know if enough institutional transformation has gone on in our field to make it survive in the long run. So I think that's the jury is out, but I think that's one thing. The second thing is to go back to your point, right? And again, it's a point about the acuity of our analytical frames. What can they help explain? So I'll give you two examples about that, right? One, right. We think we're mad today with US politics. But there was a movement in Congress after the Genocide Convention and after the Declaration of Human Rights. There was a movement in Congress to have a constitutional convention to take away the president's treaty-making rights because Southern senators or congressmen were very worried that if the US signed up, not to the declaration, but to the actual instruments of human rights and the Genocide Convention, that it would actually mean that lynching and Jim Crow would become outlawed via, via the ratification of those things.
Yeah.
And so now imagine that, and it got close to working and it didn't work, right? But imagine that, right? And compared to now, you know what I mean? Like it's always been like that, right? But what I'm saying is, isn't that an issue for IR scholars? I mean, isn't that like the fundamental bread and butter diplomacy, treaties, alliances, all that? And then the second thing is what you said about and my graduate student here, Roy Lee, who's she's trying to get stuff published in mainstream journals, and they're not treating her badly at the moment, right? But she's got a whole thesis that she's working on about why testing is distinct to use when it comes to nuclears, right? Now, testing happens either in Pacific Islands or in Nevada, close to indigenous peoples, right? But it's not considered use because it's not wartime. But the effect of the bomb is absolutely indistinct, whether it's war or peace. So the whole idea of a nuclear taboo is predicated upon the idea that indigenous lands, right, and indigenous peoples can be displaced and indigenous lands can be destroyed, right? And that's testing. Do you know what I mean?
Use is use,
Use is use.
Yeah.
I mean, it's effing nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
But that whole, edifice of security, of security studies, which is, like either a nuclear taboo or if it's not a nuclear taboo, this whole thing about the specificity of nukes and blah, blah, blah. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
Is built, at least in part, this is her argument, Roy's argument, built at least in part on a fundamentally colonial, if not racist, or at least racist in effect, distinction between use and test.
Yeah, that's important work. I mean,
so we're talking about analytical acuity.
Yeah.
Do you get what I mean? We're not talking about morals. We're not talking about who's good or bad. What can explain this world and the threats, the existential threats to this world, what can best explain them?
Yeah. This is the thing that's, I think that I don't say this, I say this with love, but like centrists, liberals, even like, technocrats who believe are like well-intentioned or whatever, but like, or political scientists even who just don't think of themselves as particularly political animals. Like I feel like there's a misconception quite often that, uh, a critical mode of analysis is like not analysis or something, or not policy relevant somehow. But it's like, I mean, I guess it depends a little bit on who's doing it, but generally speaking, it's like that's the mode of analysis that keeps that it's not moralizing, it's keeping within the frame what is like power, how power is actually working, historicizing it, like it's the farce, the fake analysis is the analysis that strips out the historical context and then tries to explain it in an imagined way, and then where the conclusion basically supports existing arrangements of power. I mean, that's the like,
I mean, people still teach the state of nature.
Mhm.
I mean, no one believes it, but people still teach
Yep.
it.
I'm sure there's a few people who believe it, but yeah. I'm sure there's people who believe eugenics too. So,
Well, yeah, there's plenty of them.
man, yeah,
But yeah, I mean, so that I think is, what and to be fair, not all so-called critical scholars really have an understanding of power either. So I mean, like this cuts all ways, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But yeah, this is about power, man.
Yeah.
This is about power.
Yeah.
I mean, empire, race. I mean,
it becomes hard to understand how power actually works when you start compartmentalizing and siloing and, viewing each thing in this like highly reductive way. Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah.
Do you like, I guess maybe like a last question. Do you think IR erased its own thinkers' engagement with these earlier things, like with Hans Morgenthau, global color line? Like, why do you think that happened?
Yeah. I think it's, so I'd need to be a little bit, have some humility. I don't think we know the full story of that. And I think that's something to do with the conjuncture, the 70s and 80s, which I think is more important than the end of the Cold War. I'm saying that, and don't ask me to explain it entirely, because I
have an
don't think I could.
intuition about what you're saying, though. Yeah.
And I think there was in all kinds of ways, there was a pushing back of a reflective capacity amongst political scientists in that time, because it felt as if all of civilization could fall. I mean, like when you read some of, like, I was doing some other stuff, but I went through all this Black Panther newsletters the other day.
Yeah.
Right? All of them are utterly convinced. It's not just the Black Panthers. Utterly convinced it's the end of US hegemony. It's the end of the Western order. It's the brand new world. It's all that kind of stuff, right? I mean, think about the oil shocks and what that did for IR, theory, and launch Kihane and Nye on a career, and all that kind of stuff, right? You know what I mean? And this consistent idea of US decline, right? Which another grad here, David Johnson, is doing some work on. And I think in those conditions, I think political science became incredibly more conservative. Not big C. I don't mean Republican.
Sure.
I don't mean it like that. I mean just small c conservative. Now, I could not I could not demonstrate that in a rigorous and convincing fashion to a reasonable skeptic. I couldn't do that. So that's where my humility is with that. But I think there's something really important about that. The fact that, for example, how many of us know that John Hertz, another big dude, I was just talking about him, the guy who coined the security dilemma. What concept in our field is more important, is more fundamental than security dilemma?
I say that all the time,
right?
Literally, yes.
Right, and you know what his first full-time job in where that was in the US? No. It wasn't Princeton, because they didn't want to admit Jews. It was Howard.
No shit.
He worked with Ralph Bunche. He didn't just he taught with Ralph Bunche.
Wow.
Merz Tate was his colleague from the history department, right? He himself in interviews says that this whole period for him was formative insofar as the struggle over Jim Crow in segregated DC formed the background for, well, not the background, the foreground for his ruminations on turning his critique of Nazism as undermining international law into an international theory called the security dilemma. And in the security dilemma book, you will find that there's a point where he says, the security dilemma is not simply an international thing. Outgroups, domestic outgroups, and he says, such as Jews, Negroes, and there he says specifically, I don't mean slaves as in ancient Rome. I mean modern day, survivors of slavery who are treated as internal hostiles and enemies to the whole system and civilization. Those can be considered part of the security dilemma too. When he publishes that book, he's been at Howard since 41, I think, 42, something like that, up until he was there for 10 years. I mean, there is evidence from his own mouth to say that this was a formative period in his life where he managed to, turn his kind of legalistic critique of Nazism into a political theory of international relations.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean that it was all about Jim Crow? No, it doesn't. But it means what was the formative and generative environment in which he did that.
Yeah.
And it was that short period in US history where actually Jim Crow, could be said to be a form of Nazism. And by the end of the Second World War, you got the army actually saying stuff like communism isn't as bad as Nazism.
Man.
Because Nazism is really about killing out all the minor races. Yeah. At least communism isn't to do with that. Yeah. And then suddenly it switches back a few years later, right? So I'm saying that there's something incredibly something's happened whereby we could totally, as if that was never a formative condition.
Yeah.
Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
So you got now Hertz and Morgenthau both engaging in the Black freedom struggle as they generate ideas about security and foreign policy. And who of us reads that? Who of us when order uprisings and protests, spontaneously combusted around the world after George Floyd? Who of us went, yeah, let's go back to Morgenthau, let's go back to Hertz? Now I'm saying like,
it really is mostly coalescing around the 70s, to your point. It's how do you venerate Kenneth Waltz of all people, Or like when we think of the security dilemma, we think of Robert Jervis 1976, which is this highly technocratized version of it. It like loses a lot of the essence. Jervis is a great scholar. It loses a lot of the essence that John Hertz had. Yeah. So like we venerate that 70s milieu. It's weird. Man. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, I probably need to get off this before I die.
Sorry. I don't know. You need to do something.
Yeah. Jeez. This has been awesome, though. I really appreciate this, and I think the audience is going to love this too. Yeah.
Well, I'm. Thanks for having me, Van. It was great to meet up and to talk, man. And I hope we talk more.
Yeah. We'll get together in ISA. Hopefully, I'll be not sick.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Take care, brother. All right.